Hi, everybody. I'm back for another week of American literature. I still miss you guys. I've heard from many of you. I've gotten assignments from many more of you. You seem to be doing pretty good. I hope that's the case. I hope that's true of all of you. I'm still standing. We're going to get through this. We're all going to see each other again. We just don't know quite when, but this has an ending. So hang with me until then. As I will remind you of this every time I do one of these videos, and my goal is to do one every week just to help out those of you who are much better auditory learners than visual. If it helps you, great. If not, don't worry, because everything you really need is in your written packet, and I will try and keep it that way for just as long as I possibly can. This week, we are moving, as promised, we are moving into stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness is one of the experimental movements. You'll remember that modernism in America, well, modernism period, was about a lot of bold experimentation. And stream of consciousness was one of those experimental movements within the movement that came up. Stream of consciousness attempts as much as possible to mimic the way the brain works unfiltered. So the people who worked in stream of consciousness basically believed that the way we write, and I'm sure you think this too because it's true when I write and it's true when you write, that the way we typically write makes our actual thought processes more cohesive than they really are. So if you want to get to the heart and soul of a character or a story, you have to do it without that filter. That's what these people believed. So they try as much as possible to reproduce the way the brain talks to itself. So without imposing that logical structure on it that we typically do when we turn something into the written word. So we're going to start, you're going to see these pieces become gradually more abstract and more like stream of consciousness. You're going to see writers more and more abandon the typical conventions of the written language. So we're going to start with The Jilting of Granny Weatherall by Catherine Ann Porter. I think most of you will like this story. It's dark, but it bears some resemblances to A Rose for Emily, which you should have already finished. While the way the story is told is very different, they are both stories about elderly women who have pretty high opinions of themselves. That makes these two stories easy to compare and contrast, which is what we're going to do with them. Now, keep in mind that while William Faulkner, who wrote A Rose for Emily, was famous for his stream of consciousness, we're not actually reading any of it. A Rose for Emily is not stream of consciousness. The innovation in A Rose for Emily is really that point of view. Because if you noticed, it is a first-person point of view, but typically when we see first-person point of view, the first-person narrator is I, like Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. In A Rose for Emily, the first-person narrator is we, because it's told from the point of view of the town as a whole instead of from any one particular character. That was and remains a very uncommon way to tell a story, but for A Rose for Emily, it really works. The Jilting of Granny Weatherall, in that sense, is going to seem much more typical to you. But the story moves around in time through flashbacks and flash forwards and things like that in a way that you probably will recognize now as trying to capture a character's thoughts. So you have long stream of consciousness passages where you're experiencing what's happening kind of within Granny Weatherall's own mind. So that's our introduction to stream of consciousness. And as you might predict, since the two stories have some things in common, the written assignment there is straight up comparison and contrast. You know how to do comparison and contrast. You do it all the time. When you say a smaller, lighter engine gives you lower top end speeds, but it makes you quicker off the line, that's comparison and contrast. We do it all the time in real life. So you're going to see a little more information about that in your packets. We're then going to move on to modernist poetry. A word of warning on modernist poetry. For those of you who, especially for those of you who are good readers, it's going to seem very difficult. Because if it makes you feel disoriented and like you have trouble understanding what's going on, these poets would consider that a compliment, because that's exactly what they're going for. They're trying not to provide you the cohesive, logical, structured universe of poetry that they were raised on. That is their innovation. So we're going to start with T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. It's very, very famous. It's lengthy. It's difficult reading. Give it its due. I would recommend you read it the first time fast, just to kind of get the rhythm of it. The modernist poets have to be felt more than thought. In fact, one of my favorite modernist poets, we won't cover him because he was Irish, so he's not American. Make Miss No do it next year. But William Butler Yeats said, "Neither Christ nor Buddha nor Socrates ever wrote a book, for to do so is to exchange life for a logical process." These poets all very much agree with that. But T.S. Eliot still has images that you can very much think through with your brain. Here's one, for instance. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. The image there is very clear. The syntax may be a little unusual for you, but the image is very clearly of a cat. It rubs its back upon the window panes, rubs its muzzle, licks its tongue into corners, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap. The image is very much that the yellow fog is a cat and behaves like one. That part of the poem you can very much understand with your brain. There are parts of it that are a little more difficult. So give it its due, read it multiple times, listen to the read-alongs. Even if you consider yourself a good reader and you don't typically do that, now's the time. This is material that was meant to be heard aloud. But for those of you who often struggle with reading and who have trouble maybe comprehending material in that very linear, logical, verbal way, you may find that you love these poets, that they make perfect sense to you. Then we're going to go past Eliot into someone who is even more experimental, and that's one of my all-time favorite poets, E.E. Cummings. Now, I will warn you, Cummings cannot be read with the brain. Cummings must be read with the teeth and the taste buds and the toes. He's all about feeling. This is an era in poetry, after all, where another different modernist poet said, the poem should not mean, but be. That's from Archibald MacLeish's Ars Poetica, which is in our textbook. We're not going to cover it because we're on kind of an abbreviated situation. But you're if you have your textbook, you're welcome to break that out and read it. But it certainly speaks to what these poets were trying to do. And regardless of whether you find this the easiest material we've done all semester or the most difficult, you're still going to have to give a kind of free rein to your instincts and your emotions. That's what they intended for you to have to do. It's a deliberate manipulation. That's the only way to approach the modernist poets. I have offered you, you're going to read 3 poems by E.E. Cummings. They're short. They're not easy reading, but they're also not very long. So I don't think you'll have, the difficulty will be in if you're trying to make too much meaning of them, because Cummings hated that. And I'm going to read aloud to you in a minute a poem that is specifically about using your teeth and your taste buds and your toes to read poetry rather than your mind. How you just can't pay too much attention to the syntax of things. In the end, if you are an English 3 student, you'll be writing a 3.8 paragraph on these poets, focusing on the elements of modernism. And I've included in your packet, again, if you didn't keep it from last time, the tenets, the elements of modernism directly out of your textbook. So this should not be too hard for you. If you are in AP Language and Composition, you're going to complete the week with a little more nuanced. You're going to go with a more in-depth 5-paragraph essay. It still doesn't need to be very long, but you will complete an entire paragraph for each of the principles that you choose and flesh it out like that. It still probably doesn't need to be more than about 1.5 pages long. But I want you to have direct quotes from the poems if you're in AP Language and Comp. So I think I have gone over just about everything that you're going to need. But I do want to leave you with a reading of one of E.E. Cummings' poems, because essentially the theme of it is the same as the theme of the Yeats quote that I read you. Neither Christ nor Buddha nor Socrates ever wrote a book, for to do so is to exchange life for a logical process. Only this is how Cummings puts it. Since feeling is first, who pays any attention to the syntax of things will never wholly kiss you. Wholly to be a fool while spring is in the world, my blood approves, and kisses are a better fate than wisdom. Lady, I swear by all flowers, don't cry. The best gesture of my brain is less than your eyelids flutter, which says we are for each other. Then laugh, leaning back in my arms, for life's not a paragraph. And death, I think, is no parenthesis. See you next week.